Let's get a songbook and turn to page number 762. Starts getting dark earlier as people start staying home. There's some at home right now listening on YouTube saying, I'm not getting out in the dark. And we've got such straight roads down here in Cunot, so it's so easy to just... There is coming a day when no heartache shall come, no more clouds in the sky, no more tears to dim the eye. All is peace forevermore on that happy golden shore. What a day, glorious day that will be. What a day that will be when my Jesus I shall see, and I look upon his face, the one who saved me by his grace. When he takes me by the hand and leads me through the promised land. What a day, glorious day that will be. There'll be no sorrow there, no more burdens to bear, no more sickness, no pain, no more parting over there, and forever I will be with the one who died for me. What a day, glorious day that will be. What a day that will be when my Jesus I shall see, and I look upon his face, the one who saved me by his grace. When he takes me by the hand and leads me through the promised land. What a day, glorious day that will be. Brother Kermit, would you pray for us? Everybody tonight, and as Brother Kermit was praying, I thought, I'm trying to remember how it was said. You know me, I hear funny things, and someone prayed the other night, and I think it was Sunday when our evangelist was here, and I think the wording was, help somebody get something out of this. And I thought, just the way that sounded, well, that sounded like this fellow's a slop. Maybe somebody gets something. And I was going to bring that up to his attention afterwards, but I forgot. I'm ashamed of myself for not pointing that out. But I just thought of it just now. But we're glad you're here tonight. I hope you've had a great week. And boy, the Lord has given us an extended summer care, and we're enjoying that. And we got all kinds of things coming up. Next, let's see, first of all, this Sunday, after evening service. Now, we're supposed to have a business meeting, so I don't know how we're going to do that. We're thinking about it because after Sunday evening service, we're going to go next door, and the teens are going to serve us and feed us, and they'll have to wait tables like a regular restaurant, so I want to give them plenty of time, and they did great last year. And so I don't know what we'll do. We'll probably not have that business meeting. I'll probably postpone it until next week because I have a few things to bring up. I don't want to waste too much time. So, but that's Sunday night. I hope you can come and be part of that. right after the evening service. I mean, hope you can come for the evening service. Don't show up. About 50 people show up after the evening service. That's not going to look good. So, but I hope you can come for it. And then next Tuesday night, there will be no service in here Wednesday, but on Tuesday we'll meet in the gym. And if you can bring a dessert, a pie, or something, or a drink, or just whatever. If you can't bring anything, that's fine too. Just go ahead and come. But we're going to try to get a little bit more organized. Last year, it seemed it went well, but we had so many people running and talking that when people was giving testimonies, I'm not sure some people ever got to hear. So we're going to try to do it a little bit better, maybe look a little more organized, but it's still a good time to come, and I hope you'll come in and be part of that. And let's see if anything else I forgot. I guess that's all I can remember for now. So that's things coming up. And now let's go. If I don't, Mr. Rich is not here yet because he's still looking down. He had his eye worked on, and he can't look up. He's had to sleep face down, walk. Everything has to be. He has to keep his head down. And I kind of got this picture in my mind. I don't know if this is the way it's been working, but maybe if he's watching on YouTube, maybe he can text Rich or somebody and let us know. But I kind of think if he tries to raise his head up, Vicky's there and hits him right in the back of the head and then knocks it back down. I don't know that, but I just kind of picture that. So I don't know if that's the way it is. But I'm hoping, last I heard he was doing well, and when I talked to him, so hopefully things is going well for him. But if you did not get a prayer list, I think there's some back there. I did not look. There's usually some extras back there, and if you need one, we can get somebody back there. I've seen Moses' dad back there walking around somewhere. Okay, what is going on our prayer list? Anything we need to update? I hear Moses' dad back there now. How about Mr. Ron Jones? How's he doing? He's home and doing all right? Okay. Well, I knew he'd come through the operation good, but I didn't know if everything's still going well. Dementia? That's what I thought. Yes, sir? That's true. Did we ever take them off the mothers and babies yet? Yes. Everything went well. So Melissa's home, not sleeping anymore because she now has a baby. Yes, Mr. Rance? Okay. So the Lanham twins they're just staying even, I guess you could say, huh? Under list number 4, if put down Pat Minks is her name. It's my cousin's wife, and she's been, when you talking about dementia, it reminded me she had some dementia early in the summer. Now she has much dementia, and she's starting to not know people and all kinds of things. Pat Minks, M-I-N-K-S. How many of you think you're going to have dementia or Alzheimer's? Is it in your family? They've always told me the people that get it never know it. So I think maybe I'm not going to get it because I keep forgetting everything. I think I got it. So if I think I got it, I must not have it. I don't know. But I know my mom's sister got it, and my mom was so worried that she was going to get it. She went to the doctor in her 60s, and the doctor gave her, I don't know what he called it, but he showed her, you get these brown blotches on your skin. He showed her, he said, those are the same things that develops on your brain. And that's what causes a lot of it. And he gave her something. He said, take this, and it'll prevent a lot of that stuff from happening. She made it to 89, and she still knew what was going on. I mean, she was crazy all that time, but she knew what was going on. It just comes from being part of our family, being crazy. But so I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't like the thought of not knowing what's going on, but maybe sometimes that might be better if I didn't know what was going on. Anything else going on we need to pray about? Surely you got something. Yes, ma'am? Oh, yes. Friday morning, you're taking off back to Tennessee. Okay. On the 25th? 27th. Okay. So pray for the clocks as they travel. Somebody else, I think Nelson's leaving. I don't know where he's going, but I think he's going somewhere this weekend. Two weeks from tonight, we're going to try something, a series. I would tell you what it is, but I don't know what it is. And I'm not going to be the one teaching it either, so that'll make it better. So you try to come 2 weeks from tonight and see what gets started on a Wednesday night. We're trying to keep people interested. We change things around a lot, and for some people that's not interesting. Some people hate it when you change anything. We may have everybody that sits over here sit in the middle, just to see what happens. And everybody that's over here, sit on the far side. I don't know if we can function like that. We probably won't do that. That's true. Well, that's what I got this side right now on heat, this side on air conditioning, so I don't really, but yes, sir. Yes. Wow. How do you spell that? Finn? Two N's? Finn family. It's hard to imagine sometimes what these people go through things like that, and you think, boy, I don't know how I'd react if I had to face that many deaths that quick, and it's difficult. Okay, well, we will come back to the list toward the end of the service, and if you got your Bibles open to the 1 Thessalonians chapter number 2. 1 Thessalonians chapter number 2, and I'll start with sort of a question because I'm not sure now. When I was in school, I don't remember if they did this in high school, but in grade school, in middle school, you brought home a report card, and somebody had to sign it and take it. Do they do that still? Do they sneak them in? Do they just send them on text? Or do they? I don't know what they do. And but I remember it was that way, and I remember hearing all kinds of stories. And in fact, I read a story about a boy named Billy. He brought his report card home. Unfortunately, had 2 F's on it. But he was a smart fella in other ways. And so he brought it to his dad. He said, Dad, here's my report card. And I brought a couple of yours that I found upstairs in the attic too. Dad had a few F's in his day, so that's a smart fella right there. But you ever think, this is a side note, but now that I've talked about report cards things, there's a strange thing about when you get when you got report cards, if you got an F, you knew what that stood for. You fail. It's failing grade. But nothing else really stood for anything. I mean, A, that mean awesome? No. If you got an A, it meant you did excellent. So why wasn't it E? And B, that means you did something beautiful? No, that means good. And C, that means they was complacent? No, that meant they were average. D, does that mean they was despicable? I think sometimes it might have, but that meant poor. And then they skipped E. Why'd they skip E? I don't know. They just went to F. And so I don't know. And it seemed like some strange things in the way that we do report cards, but maybe you never had an F. I think I can honestly say I never had an F. I don't remember ever getting one. I remember the teacher threatening me with one. And I've told this story before, but in middle school choir, they scheduled us to go places and sing on Sunday. And I told them, I'm not going. I'm in church on Sunday. I'm not going to go to that. Well, you're going to get an F. I said, well, I think I got good enough grades during the year that I can balance out that F, and I still ended up with a C. But I remember the teachers just sort of like a threat. Well, you're going to get an F. I can't help it. I said, I don't drive, and I guarantee you Mom and Dad's not going to bring me down here on a Sunday to sing somewhere else. So that didn't work out. But I don't remember ever getting an F, and I'm not going to go back and look just in case. I feel a lot better just thinking than I did. But I thought about this. We're going to be talking tonight how God turns failure, which would be an F, into his favor. And I'm going to read some verses here in a moment. But I was thinking about the evangelist that came here last Sunday night. He's a young evangelist, actually just getting into evangelism, just beginning. But I thought this. Let's just suppose that he was coming here, and somehow this church had voted him in as pastor, and he was coming here for his first time, and he's getting ready to preach. Maybe he's preached here and candidated, and he got the job, but now he's coming back, and he's getting ready to be the pastor. And someone finds out, you know what? Where he came from, he was locked up in jail. Now what happened? Well, people you don't trust him as much. Then there's some things you're not sure about, and so you start maybe talking a little bit around behind his back and saying things. And so he preaches here, and he preaches for 3 weeks, and things get so tough on him that in the middle of the night, he loads up his family in his car, and he leaves town. Would you consider that to be a very successful pastorship? Didn't sound like it to me. But could I tell you that's exactly what happened to Paul? We're going to read about it, a little bit about it. But when he came to Thessalonica, he had just left Philippi. If you remember in Philippi, they beat him and threw him in jail. And when he got to Thessalonica, his wounds, I imagine his wounds is probably still a little sore and things. And he preached there for 3 weeks. And after 3 weeks of preaching there was enough people that didn't like him. They kind of formed a mob, and they was looking for him. They was going to drag him and Silas out of town, and so they hid. And in the middle of the night, they snuck out of Thessalonica, and they went to Berea. And then in Berea, they was there for a few weeks, and the mob got word of where they was, so they went down there and stirred up another mob down there, and they had to leave again. This time, he's headed to Athens. So it doesn't sound real successful, but if you're in 1 Thessalonians chapter number 2, let's see what Paul says a little bit about this. He says, in verse number 1, says, "For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain." Let me change that, since when I'm preaching on failure, I'm preaching about how God turns failure into a favor. Let me say it this way. He's saying, it was not a failure when I came to you. Sounded like it did. But he says it wasn't in vain. It wasn't like I'd have been better off staying home. I'd have been better off doing it. No, he goes on in verse 2, says, "But even after that we had suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as you know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak. Not as pleasing men, but God, which trieth our hearts. For neither at any time use we flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak of covetousness. God is witness. Now we'll stop there, but I would say by just about any standards of the world that we live in today, Paul's visit to Thessalonica would be considered a failure. He preached 3 weeks. He was run out of town. But Paul, to me, is a great example of how God turns our failures into his favor. I thought I wanted to think about tonight, or ask ourselves tonight, is where have there been failures in your life? Where has there been areas you think, man, this wasn't good? And maybe it's a failed job. I'm amazed how many people I talk to, and when I was a supervisor up there, I'm amazed how many people. A lot of people just get fired nowadays, and I remember one of my bosses. He wasn't there too long, but I remember him telling me, "Well, I think it's a good." He said, "I don't think people should stay anywhere a long time." He said, "About 4 or 5 years is about as long as a person ought to stay somewhere." Of course, I don't know why I didn't get fired, because my answer to him was, I said, is that because that's about as long as people can stay anywhere? I said, that doesn't make a bit of sense to me, saying something like that. And he didn't like it. But so maybe it's a failed job, or maybe someone asked you to resign, or maybe you think maybe you applied for something, maybe you applied for a job, didn't get it, or got turned down, or applied for a scholarship, didn't get it. Failed marriages, just a lot of failed things in life we would see. And there's people that, probably some in here, that you say, well, you know what, my health is failing. And we've had some financial failures. And the fact is, all of us has failed somewhere. And so for everybody who's ever failed or will fail in the future, I want to try to pick out from what Paul said in these verses we just read, 4 lessons that we can learn about overcoming failure, because it does happen. And the first lesson would be simply this, and I think I preached a message about this maybe a couple months back, because the thought sticks in my mind, but I just can't remember what I said then, so that's all right, it'll be different here. But my first thought would be simply this: failure does not have to be fatal. It doesn't have to be the end of everything. I mean, if you read here, after Paul makes his introductory remarks, he was real quick to say, our entrance unto you was not in vain. Our coming to see you, that wasn't a failure. Now, why do you think he made that statement? I got an opinion. Here's what I think. I think there's probably people running around saying, "I tell you what, we run that Paul out of town. He didn't do a bit of good here. He didn't get anything accomplished here because we put him out of town." I think his enemies were probably saying that. He was nothing but a failure when he come here. And Paul said, let me tell you this, it wasn't a failure. There was enough done. And now, I'm sure when it happened, he was disappointed. I don't think Paul said, let me sign up back here on the back so I can get, have you got a run out of town sheet? I want to sign up for it. I don't think nobody wants to get run out of town. But what Paul does, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this with people that used to be president of our United States down through the years, and you'll see how this works. But what Paul did is he took the perspective of time. And he says, it may have seemed a failure on that day, but when you add the time, you'll find that God takes what we think is a failure, and he's working things out for good. And that's what God does. Now, I just think that a lesser man would have probably given up preaching. I told this story here before. I remember when I was younger, we was over in the FAR building when it was really small, and we had some screen doors on the back and fans in the windows and a fan in the back, and it was middle of the summer and it was hot, and there was a young man who decided he thought God had called him to preach. And I don't have any idea. I don't remember a bit about what he said. I don't remember a bit about how good it was, but I do remember we had a lady live down the road here, and she showed up about 15 minutes into the service, and she always walked, and her dogs always came with her, and they were all about that tall, and there was about 5 of them. And on this day, they decided they liked to be Baptists and get in on the church service. And so about 10 minutes into his message, them dogs got through that screen doors, and they began chasing each other, running around the church, barking and jumping, and I don't think he ever stood in the pulpit again. And truth is, I'm not sure he ever stood in church anywhere again. I never did know what happened to him, but it was not a good day for him. And I'm thinking, with Paul getting all these things that happened to him, and he got run out of town, and he'd been beaten 2 places, probably a lesser man had said, you know what, I'm giving this up. This ain't for me. Arrested, beaten, but he kept on preaching. And again, the truth is we all fail at one time or another, but it doesn't have to define us. I can't remember Edison, I think was the fellow that did all the failures in electrical stuff, and eventually he come up with some pretty good things, but he could have quit. But just because you failed, that doesn't mean you're a failure. Here's what the Bible says in Proverbs 24, says, "For a just man falleth 7 times and rises up again." So even righteous, good people will fail and they'll fall, but when the righteous, he says, they get up and they try again. They go on. They continue on. And really, the Bible sometimes reads like a who's who of failures. I thought about this. We often talk about Hebrews chapter 11 as we call it the roll call of faith. But it could also be called the roll call of failures. Because let me list you some names of people in there. In Hebrews 11 is a man named Abraham. You know what he did? He lied about his wife, about Sarah being his wife. Said she was his sister. And then there's Jacob and his mother Rebekah. They lied to Isaac in order to steal a blessing that was Esau's. And then also in Hebrews 11, there's this man named Moses. He killed a man. And then later he lost his temper, and God said, you don't get to go with everybody else into the promised land. You don't make it. And then there's Simon Peter, which he's not necessarily in there, but I'm thinking of people like this. But Simon Peter, he boasted to Jesus. You'll remember there in the New Testament, he said, listen, I know you'll John here and some of these others. You may not be able to trust them, but you can trust me. I'll never forsake you. But he never lived up to that promise. And he denied the Lord 3 times. But the thing about Peter was he repented, he got restored, and he went back doing what he should have been doing. There's a fellow named John Maxwell. Some of you's read some of his books. He wrote a lot of books on leadership. And he says this. I'm just going to read a paragraph of what he said. He said, failing doesn't mean I'm a failure. It just means I've not yet succeeded. Doesn't mean I've accomplished nothing. Just means I've learned something. Doesn't mean I've been a fool. It just means I've had the courage to take a risk. It doesn't mean God has abandoned me. It just means God has a better idea. So my first thought, the lesson we can learn about overcoming failure is it's not final. It's not fatal. God can bring us back from failure. And that brings me to my second lesson. I see, thinking of what Paul says here, failure can be sort of like a fertilizer to success. Now, I'm not trying to encourage people to fail. That's not my goal. Now, our goal is not to try to set out to fail, but it's going to happen sometimes. But I'm thinking about Paul here. Since he got run out of town, he's kind of understood God's purpose for his life. And he says in verse number 4 here, he says, but as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel. He's saying God's given us a really valuable resource here. He's given us the gospel. He's entrusted that to us. And so I'm just going to go on. And yeah, things didn't work here, but I've learned a few things, and I'm going to do some things a little bit here that'll make it work a little better the next place I go. And now again, in the way we think today, I guess you could say our conventional wisdom would tell us that people who succeed, they never fail, and failures never succeed. But that's not the truth at all. None of that's the truth. Failure's not final, and it's just sort of kind of like it kind of helps to get things going in the future. It kind of helps you to learn some things from it. In fact, the only thing that's final, and I think this is sort of where I preached a couple months back on this, the only thing that makes it final is when you just quit. And I know people that's done that. I know people that struggled. They've tried this. They've tried to help. They've tried to serve God, and they struggled. They tried to quit doing something that they knew was wrong, and they fell back, and so they just give up. I just quit. Well, that's failure. When you quit, when you give up, you have failed. But here's another thought. Some people that you and I consider successful, or this world considers successful, they experience failure. And I'm going to name some people. I'm not going to name them. I'm going to name them some things they did, and you just see if you can figure out who it is before I tell you. This fellow was fired from a newspaper, and here was the reason. They said he lacks imagination and he has no original ideas. His name? Walt Disney. Hard to imagine, but it happened. Here's a lady that was demoted from her job as a news anchor because the producer told her, you're not fit for television. Her name? Oprah Winfrey. As a 30-year-old, this fellow was devastated and depressed after he was removed from a company that he started. His name, Steve Jobs. This fellow failed the 6th grade and was defeated in every election for public office until he became England's prime minister. That helps a little bit. Winston Churchill. And here's, I'll give two more. One more, really. This fellow was fired after his first performance at the Grand Ole Opry, and he was told by the manager, you ain't going nowhere, son. You ought to go back to driving a truck. His name was Elvis Presley. Somebody knew that one. And then I'll give you, you've probably heard this speech, but in 2006, Michael Jordan made a television commercial for Nike. And here's what he said. He said, I've missed over 9,000 shots. I lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. Well, Paul spent a whole lot of his ministry in prison, and yet Paul didn't never consider himself a failure, and he wouldn't be called a failure. In fact, he boasted that being in jail gave him the opportunity to share the gospel. Here's what he said in Philippians chapter 1. He says, but I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel. Well, what had happened to him? He got thrown in prison for preaching. He said it happened so that God can further the gospel. I can take the gospel places that I couldn't go any other way. Places he wanted to take it to Rome. He wanted to take it to certain people in the palace. He couldn't get there until they chained themselves to him, and then he was able to preach to those people. He goes on, verse 13 says, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. So I consider Paul like the original optimist. He turned his, well, they always tell you, if you get lemons, make lemonade. Well, he did that. And he turned his jailhouse into a church house. And they had a service. When after him and Silas got beat, they started singing, started praising God. And those people that was chained to him, he made them his congregation. And he turned his prison into a pulpit. And some of you heard of the name of Charles Colson. He was an Ivy League trained lawyer, a former Marine captain, and a very strong, in fact, he was described in what I was reading, a bloodthirsty political fighter. He made this statement one time. He said he'd walk over his own grandmother to reelect Richard Nixon. Well, the turning point in his life was when he was convicted in the Watergate scandal, and they sent him to federal prison. And just before he was sentenced to prison, a friend of his gave him a book by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity. And he read it, and he was such at a low point in his life, he realized how much he needed Christ, and he got saved. And when he got out of prison, he founded the Prison Fellowship. He was the author of some 30 Christian books. He had a syndicated radio program called Breakpoint that had, I think, 1,400 stations with it. He received the Templeton Prize for religious work, and President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Citizens Award. So here's a man that looks like a failure. In fact, his failure became what I called the fertilizer for his success. He wrote a book called Born Again, and in it he said, the real legacy of my life was my biggest failure, that I was an ex-convict. My greatest humiliation, being sent to prison, was the beginning of God's greatest use of my life. In fact, the pastor of his church in Florida said the people in his church were surprised to learn that he was an ex-con because all they knew him as was a great Christian leader. That's because God can take human failure and he can turn it into what I would call heavenly favor. So again, lessons I learned about, well, failure is not intended to be fatal. It doesn't have to be fatal unless we decide we're going to quit and give up on God. Number two, failure can be the fertilizer for success. It just kind of gives you one more thing. I've learned this doesn't work, so I'm going to try something else. But number three, the formula for failure. If you want to just sign up for it, here's a good formula for it. Try to please everybody. Doesn't work. There was a whole lot of people who was opposed to Paul, but Paul was not the victim of this disease to please people. That is what we have in the world we live today in politics. People, I don't think anybody stands for anything. I think they listen to see who's going to vote for them, and they go that direction. And I don't think that's a good thing. But Paul wrote this. In these verses we just read, he says, "Not as pleasing men, but God." And I was reading a fellow named Herbert Swope. He was the first winner of the Pulitzer Prize for reporting. And here's what he's most famous for, his quote. He says, "I cannot give you a formula for success, but I can give you the formula for failure. Just try to please everybody." And there's a lot of truth to that, because people are too fickle. You can't do it. Paul said later in Galatians, he says, "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ." And you will find in your life, we're going to be oftentimes in between, am I going to try to please people? Am I going to try to please God? I was thinking about this afternoon as I was driving. There's a family, and I'm not going to mention their name because some of you might know some of them, but there was a family. They've been this part of this church. They've not been part of this church, and sometimes they have been, sometimes it wasn't. I don't know, but they struggle in many areas of their life. They can't walk. They can't seem to be faithful in about anything. They have, I don't know, they feel like everybody's watching them and against them. I don't know what makes people like that. I don't know what makes people do that. But it seems like they're always saying, well, so these people is looking down on me. I remember a lady come into church back there one time, and she left. And I caught her, and she was here, and she said, well, said the people thought, she started telling me what people was thinking about her. And I said, who said that to you? I said, because she hadn't even got into the church. She just got to the entrance. And I said, they told you that back there at the back of the door when you come in? No. I said, well, who said it to you? Well, nobody said. I could see it in their eyes. I said, so you've done determined all these people hate you for something you can see in their eyes? I said, they don't even know who you are. They have no reason to think those things about you. I said, you have a really guilty complex is what you've got. And that didn't help either, so now she's still gone. But the thought is, these people that I'm talking about, there's no way that you can please them. So you just do the best you can, and if they get mad, they get mad. You can't stay awake nights worried about it, because there's some people like that. And you've heard this several times, but it's still worth repeating. If you please God, it really doesn't matter who you displease. And if you displease God, it doesn't matter who you please. But I did find a good old story. It's not true, but it's a good story. It's a fable about an old man and his grandson and a donkey. And thinking about trying to please everybody. Well, they was going into a city, and the boy was riding on the donkey, and the old man was walking alongside. They went by a group of people, and the people remarked how terrible it is for this young boy to ride and that old man to walk. Well, they heard the critics, so they thought, we better change that. So they changed places. They went a little farther. Another group said, what a shame that this little boy like that to walk, and the old man riding and make this little boy walk. So they listened to the critics, and they both got on the donkey. And they both rode. Well, then they went by another group, and they said, how cruel these two to put such a burden on that donkey. So now they're listening to the critics. They're right. So they decided, we're going to carry the donkey. So they picked up the donkey, and they carried it across the bridge, and they lost their grip, and they fell in the river, and he drowned. And the point of the story is, if you listen to every critic, you'll lose your assurance of success. And there was a little joke to that in there, but I didn't want to throw it in. So, but the fact is, you can't please people. It doesn't work. And so, the formula for failure, just try to make everybody happy. Try to please everybody. And I will tell you, as I've talked to several preachers, and I remember when I first started pastoring this church. In my mind, if you just do what's right, and you spend a lot of time talking to God in prayer, you just do the basic things you're supposed to do. You hear all these stories that this will happen, and this turns and this happens. But I thought to myself, that can never happen if you just walk where you ought to walk. And you know what? It can happen, because we live in a messed up world, and things happen. And so you have to realize there's going to be failures anyhow, but you can't. You have to try to please God. If you please people along the way and they're pleased and God, then you're fine. But if people, now let me say this, I know some people and I know some preachers, it's almost like their goal is not just to please God, it's to make sure I make people mad. That's not a goal. My intent is never to make someone mad. Some people get mad, but I didn't do it. I didn't try to make them mad. I didn't set out to make them mad. They just got mad, and that I can't do anything about. If my intent is to make you angry, if my intent is to be obnoxious and things like that to people, then I'm in the wrong, and I'm not pleasing God anyhow. I might convince myself I am, but I'm not. So let's not try to please everyone, and that brings me to my last lesson we can learn about overcoming failure, is that God uses our failures to test us. Now, Paul understood that temporary failure was just a test. He said this, in verse 4 he talks about, he says, God which trieth our hearts. And our whole life is full of tests. I mean, when you get in school, as soon as you get in school, they start testing you. Even before school. Now we start school when you're about 3 years old, and they're testing you to see where you belong and where you ought to be. But you have to pass tests, and you can't graduate until you pass tests. And if you get caught cheating on a test, that's really bad. In fact, Coach Kylie's not here tonight. I was going to embarrass him, but I'll go ahead anyhow because he might be listening at home on YouTube. But when Coach Kylie used to be the football coach over here at Cloverdale, and he had a star quarterback. But one of the teachers caught him cheating on a test. And so he wasn't going to be able to play on the Friday night game, big game. And so Coach Kylie come in, he's kind of upset, and he asked the teacher, he said, how do you know that my quarterback cheated? And she said, well, he was sitting across from the smartest girl in the class, and they had the exact same score. And he said, now that doesn't really prove anything. That could be a coincidence. And so she showed the two tests, and she said, look here at question number 10. She said, question number 10, the smart girl's answer is, I don't know. And on question number 10, your quarterback's answer is, I don't know either. So that was all made up, but I thought it was a pretty good joke to pick on Coach Kylie. But the fact is, exams, you can't, they're all of our life. And we talk about final exams, but is there really ever a final exam in this life? No. Because even when you get out of school, you still got all kinds of tests, all kinds of, you know why I got these? I flunked the eye tests. So there's eye tests, there's stress tests, there's blood tests, there's taste tests, and everything. Everything's tested. And the Bible says this in Isaiah 48, says, behold, I have refined thee, but not with silver. I have chosen thee in the furnace of affliction. And there's a lot of places in the Bible where God talks about refining us. And to refine something is you're just taking out all the impurities. If it's an oil refinery, the gases or something, the other elements, everything's removed from crude oil to make it pure. And that's why God allows adversity in our life, because through adversity, through troubles, through problems, He takes a lot of things out that's not like Christ. A lot of things in us that we don't need there, but sometimes it takes problems to get it there. In fact, I was reading a thing where in Christianity Today, they did a survey. It's been several years back now, but they asked people to name the time in their life when they grew the most spiritually. And the number one answer was during times of personal trouble, personal adversity, is when people grow the most. We learned that we need the Lord. And I thought about that. Here at Faith Baptist Church, we're interested in helping people grow spiritually. And so I've put a team together, and we're trying to bring about a way that we can bring more stress to everybody's life. No, we're not really doing that, but it did remind me of that commercial, that fellow that's always doing mayhem. I can't remember what I can't remember what the commercial is. Anyhow, it's an insurance commercial, and he's bringing mayhem and always trouble in your life, put you on the fast track. I guess if we could do that, that'd put everybody on the fast track to spiritual growth, but that's not what we're trying to do. Actually, what we're trying to do is get everybody, for one, be an encouragement to each other, help each other, and get involved in church activities, get involved in Sunday school, get involved with each other as Christians, and that's a lot better than chaos. Chaos comes on its own. You don't have to work on that. It'll come. The problems will come, but what we have to remember is during those times of adversity, God's testing us. He's refining us in His furnace of affliction. And I was looking into some of those things, and I've heard this before, but I looked up some things, and when they refine silver, it said that they heat the impure ore up over 1,800 degrees. And as it melts, of course, they skim the impurities off the top of it. And the way the silversmith knows when the silver is pure is it becomes like a mirror and he can see his reflection in it. Well, there's a good lesson in that. You've probably heard this lesson before, but there's a lot of truth in it. When God has a heat in our lives, and he's watching us, but he brings affliction and he brings things in our lives, and how does he know when we're purified? Well, when he can see the reflection of his Son in our character. And the truth is, when God can see the reflection of Christ in our character, people around us can see it too. And that's what he's wanting. So my thought tonight is simply this: God turns our failures into his favor. Now, I mentioned a little bit about this a while ago. I'll give you some examples and we'll be done. The majority of people in America considered President Bush, the second President Bush, the younger one, to be a failure. Well, I thought personally I thought he was a good president. Now that's all right. People can disagree. Most of the things I think today, nobody else in the world agrees with me, or very few people in the world agree anyhow. So, but I do know this: he wasn't a very good speaker. But I always felt like he acted upon his convictions. He used the courage to act on his convictions. I say all that because back in 1937, George Gallup, he started a poll. The presidential job approval ratings, and you hear them all the time. And the public was asked this simple question: do you approve or disapprove of the way President so-and-so, whichever president it was, do you approve of the way he's handling his job as president? So I looked up some little presidential trivia to throw out tonight before we end up. And President George W. Bush had the highest one-time approval rating of any president ever, 90% after the 9/11 incident. But now, let me clarify something. The last two presidents, the current president and the president before him, was not in on any of these statistics, so these are a little bit older. But George W. Bush had the highest ratings, but he also had the highest one-time disapproval rating of 71% back in October of 2008. But then here's something else. When I looked at the average, his average approval rating over his entire term was higher than someone who everyone said was very highly liked, which was President Obama. George W. Bush was higher. His was 49.9. Obama's was 49%. And I read that and I think that's just how fickle people are. But since that poll began in 1937, here was the part that I found the most interesting. Who do you think had the lowest approval rating of all those presidents? I'll give you a clue. He was president long before I was around. His name was Harry Truman. Now, and here's what's funny. Today, if you go back and look, he rates fairly high. Back in the 60s, all of a sudden, his ratings started coming up. But for the most part, he was the lowest. His numbers still show that he was the lowest. But now, if you talk, it's sort of like when President Reagan was in, I remember I couldn't find anybody that liked him. Everybody hated him. And then a few years after he died, he was one of the greatest presidents we ever had. Everybody's talking. And I thought, where was all them people at when he was alive and he was president? But here's some things about Harry Truman that I found interesting. 10 days after he was sworn in as vice president, the president died. Franklin Roosevelt died, and Truman was now commander-in-chief of the United States 10 days after being sworn in as vice president. His approval rating was, for the entire time, 45.4. That was his average. He made some tough decisions. It was Truman who decided, we're going to stop this war and drop the atomic bombs in Japan. That didn't make him very popular. It was Truman who decided that he was going to fire General MacArthur during the Korean War. That didn't help very much. But his most unpopular decision was made on May 14th, 1948. At midnight, Israel time, which was 6 o'clock Washington, D.C. time, the British ended their control of the area called Palestine. At that same moment, midnight their time, 6 o'clock our time, the state of Israel declared their statehood. Well, President Truman knew this was about to happen, and they'd spent several days arguing with his cabinet about it, and the majority of his cabinet was against it, including Secretary of State George Marshall, who was very, it said when I read it, it said he was violently opposed to recognizing Israel. Well, at 6:11 p.m., 11 minutes after midnight in Tel Aviv, President Truman's press secretary made this statement. He said, the president has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine. The United States recognizes the provisional government as a de facto authority of the new state of Israel. So the very first nation to recognize Israel was the U.S. And against advice from most of his cabinet, Harry Truman recognized Israel when they were 11 minutes old. And Harry Truman is still considered, by the average, one of the worst presidents. And what happened after that? Again, there's amazing things. And we probably knew all this when you went through history class, but that was 40-some years ago that I went through it, so I had to be updated on it. But chaos kind of went right after this. 3 members of his cabinet threatened to resign, but they ended up staying. But they always disagreed with his decision. Congress, of course, was upset because he didn't really ask them. He didn't consult them. He just made the decision. And one day later, they became a nation on the 14th. We recognized them on the 14th. On the 15th, they were attacked by the Arab armies all around them, and this started the first Arab-Israeli war. But they had an ally. They had one. They had the United States. And so here's a man who has had the reputation of being the most unpopular president. And a lot of people would say he was a failure. But here's some things that I kind of liked about him as I read the story. He wasn't going by what people thought. He didn't care about popular opinion. He wasn't afraid to fail. In fact, he's the one that made the famous statement, the buck stops here. But when they asked him about his unpopular decisions, here's what he said. I like this. He said, how far would Moses have gone if he'd taken a poll in Egypt? He said, what would Jesus have preached if he'd taken a poll in Israel? And he said, what would happen to the Reformation if Martin Luther had taken a poll? He said, it's not polls or public opinion of the moment that counts. It's about what's right and what's wrong in leadership. And he decided this is what's right, this is what I'm going to do. Now, even if he had been wrong, I'd have to respect somebody that makes that decision. And the fact is, we've all failed. But we have to remember, it's not fatal. It's just the fertilizer for success. And if you're trying to please people, you're headed for the failure. What's important is pleasing God. According to the world standard of today, Paul was a failure. He was unpopular. He usually had a mob chasing him. Spent more time in jail than he did in motels. I probably didn't have motels anyhow, but he was shipwrecked, he was beaten, he was stoned. When Nero was the emperor, Paul was locked in prison in Rome. They took him out of prison and they cut his head off. The moment his head was severed from his body, he was, in his own words, absent from the body, present with the Lord. A failure? Well, think about this. We've got people in our church today named Paul. We name our kids Paul. We name our dogs Nero. Nero's the one that had his head cut off. Now, there might be some people named Nero. I don't want to talk bad about him, but the thought is God can turn human failure into heavenly favor. And he did that in the life of Paul. And we need to remember it because there's going to be failures in our life. Don't quit. Stay in the battle. Now, we're a little bit early, but not as early as I like to be. But if you've got a prayer list, let's spend a little bit of time. And my wife scolded me last week. She said, too many people don't pray. I don't know what to do about it. So we've got electric shocks on your seat. If you get up within a certain amount of time, you will be shocked. It will take you all the way to the floor. Then you'll have to pray from your knees because you won't be able to get back up for about 10 minutes. That's not true, but it sounded like a good story, didn't it? But thank you for being here tonight, and we hope to see you back here on Sunday. And we're going to talk a little bit of something. I don't know exactly what. I got about 42 ideas going through my head, but some thoughts about Thanksgiving's coming up. We may as well talk a little bit about it and why you and I could be grateful people. So we'll see you on Sunday. Unless you're traveling somewhere, then you be careful out there. Let's go to prayer.